Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Bimmer barn. Today we're going to be showing you how to install the VRSF inlets on your N54 car without cutting up the factory ones. So this is actually the method by VRSF that they have in their installation PDF, and we're going to go ahead and try it out and see if you can remove these inlets without getting a Sawzall out. So I hope you guys enjoy the video, and if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing and smashing that like button. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get straight to work. So here we have the inlets from VRSF, and these silicone tubes are a great upgrade from the factory plastic ones, not only because they're going to try to insulate the air a little bit better when it's going through the turbo, but also because the inlet size is actually much larger over where it goes over the turbo. So instead of having basically a restriction right there, and I'll show you guys later, it's a much larger diameter, and that's going to help flow more air even on the factory turbos. So the challenges with installing these is that removing the old inlets is pretty tricky. Actually, getting these on can be a little bit of a pain too, but removing the old inlets, specifically the rear one, is very difficult. The front you can kind of snake out, and installation is pretty easy as well. You just want to make sure that you have clearance over where the belts go. But the back one specifically is hard to remove the factory inlet because of the weird shape that these things have. And this one's a little bit bendy, so it's easier to install, but the factory inlet is made out of plastic, and so that's why a lot of times you would cut right here. But I think we're going to challenge ourselves today and try to remove them without doing any cutting, and let me show you guys how. So here we are looking at my N54, and currently I don't have a charge pipe installed. I'm missing the expansion tank. I haven't put coolant in the systems yet, or even power steering fluid for that matter. So it's mainly a dry motor, although it is running, and that's going to make things a little bit easier for us in the next few moments, because the VRSF installation instructions tell you that you can actually lower the engine slightly by removing the bolts for the front subframe and a couple of things like the charge pipe and I think the intake manifold. But just by lowering the motor in the front, you should be able to remove the rear inlet and have it come out. And you're just gonna kind of tilt it on the rear transmission mount and use a jack at the front here to lower just a couple of inches is what we need to do. So I don't think that we're gonna have to remove too much, although we might just remove the connections for the radiator because we don't want to put too much stress on that. But let's find out. Let's see if we can get the rear inlet off without cutting it to remove it, and just by removing some of the subframe related things and lowering the motor a couple inches. That's my challenge today. The front inlet, it's going to be pretty easy to install. You know, we can basically see it 100% right here. There is a little bit of a mess of hoses to get it routed through right here, and then we'll have to get it seated on the turbos. And remember, these things get clamped down with a hose clamp on each of the turbos to make sure that they don't slip off or anything. And then up here, we should be able to mate up to the factory airbox, which is going to be really cool. So I'm excited to use the factory airbox with these inlets because I think it's going to have a really cool sleeper look to the engine bay here. So let's start by getting a good look at the inlet in the rear. I think it's held in by 3 different bolts, so we want to make sure that we can access those either now or when the engine is lowered, and then we'll start loosening things and removing the hoses so that we can get the engine lowered a little bit and hopefully be able to slip that rear inlet out. So we've got the motor lowered to a comfortable point, as low as I want to go, honestly. You can see some of the hoses starting to bind up, mainly this one, but it's not like the radiator is under too much tension or anything. You can see we still have some play in there, and the low radiator hose is still perfectly loose. Everything else looks fine, and we have definitely some added clearance here at the back of the motor to play with this rear inlet. So I think we're going to go ahead and start by the 2 bolts that are at the top of the inlet, and then we've got one that holds a little bracket on the side here. And the VRSF instructions say to remove the intake manifold to get this thing out, but we're going to see if we can remove the rear inlet without removing the intake manifold. So let's see if we can get this thing unbolted and out of the car. What a win. Look at that, guys. I didn't think it could be done. And pretty quickly, too. It just took like an hour for me to loosen the things I had to loosen. Obviously, you know, I'm pretty quick. Things are already half taken apart on this car. But wow. And let me show you guys just how much we had to lower the subframe, because I just had to keep going a little bit lower at a time just to get that perfect position. So I would say this is probably like 4 inches right here. You can see the rear bolt as well, 4 inches. I don't think we would have been able to go that far if the steering was still connected. So be sure to remove that. And then also over here, I removed the 2 bolts that hold this harness to the motor because it was getting pretty tight here. And as you're lowering it, you just want to make sure that everything is still, you know, in a position where it can be bent, pulled on, and it's not like too tight and gonna like pull something apart. Because as you can see, this motor is really dropped lower right now. So like I said, about 4 or 5 inches, get that thing lowered. And here we are, we've got the rear inlet removed. Right there are the 2 T30s. And then you also have this bracket on the back of the motor here that wraps around the inlet. And you have to remove the T30 that's on there as well. So this is probably the best time to install our new inlet. So let me go ahead and grab it and we'll throw it on. You can tell that the rear one is the rear one because it has the extra port for the PCV heater element. And that's this thing right here. So we are gonna have to remove it and transfer it onto the new inlet once we get everything squared away. But for now, let me go put a hose clamp on this and then we'll snake it around the back side of the motor and get it in a good position so that we can get the motor back up and then tighten the hose clamp once everything is secure with the subframe, because you don't want to be necessarily under the engine while the jack is holding it up. So let's get this thing installed. So at this point, we've got the rear inlet installed. You can see it, it's pretty obvious right there. And I have the hose clamp for it, and we should be able to access it. You can see the ribs of it right there. So I'm thinking either right here through the motor mount, we go ahead and throw a 7mm socket on it and tighten that thing down, or we can have access to it if we go around the wastegate actuator right here. And I did get the inlet placed onto the turbo while the engine was still down, so that was a great opportunity. Kind of just had to sneak my hand in here and get it mounted on the turbo, and then we put the motor up. And so now we're going to go ahead and tighten down the clamp on it, and then we can do the front inlet. So now we have the rear inlet fully installed, and I have to say it wasn't as bad as everyone makes it out to be. The PCV hose lines up great. We've got the block off cap for the diverter valves because we're going to be venting to atmosphere over here. And it looks like the location, it's really flexible, so it'll probably line up to the airbox, hopefully easy. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and do the front inlet. This one is not as difficult, I don't think. Although that one did make it look really easy in the rear. The only trouble is that we're going to have to do some funny routing to get it through all the coolant hoses that are down here. So there's just two T30 bolts that hold the inlet on the front, and it might be easier to remove this radiator hose, but I don't think we need to. And then hopefully we'll be able to snake this thing out. So we got the front inlet off, and we did have to remove this radiator hose as well as the Mickey Mouse hose here because the inlet actually goes behind it, so to get more access. So if you're doing this at home, you're probably going to need to drain the coolant out of your cooling system, that way you don't make this big mess. But yeah, let's go ahead and take a look at the new stuff. So here it is, the VRSF inlet compared to the factory one. And of course, we have that benefit of these being silicone inlets and insulating from heat a little bit better. But look at the huge difference in diameter that you get from the opening going into the turbo. So this is the air that goes into the turbo, so it's not charged air or anything. But look at that limiting factor. This goes around the outside of the turbo, and so does this lip of the inlet right here. But look at how small the diameter is of the pipe that really lets air in. So that's why everyone says to do inlets, is because you can get more volume of air into the turbo, and thus in theory you can get more volume out of it. Especially on upgraded turbos, you're going to see benefits having the inlets, but I'm very curious to see what kind of gains we're going to see on the factory turbos. So we're going to go ahead and start installing this thing now. Remember, just like the old one, we're going to lay a clamp onto the inlet first and then route it onto the turbo. And when you install the clamp, you don't have to have a ton of torque on it because these things aren't under charge pressure or anything, so you're never going to see boost on that clamp. But just go ahead and tighten it enough that it doesn't wiggle itself off of the turbo. So let's go ahead and install this thing now and get to work. All right, so we've got the front inlet pipe installed, and right here you can see the clamp on the turbo itself, and I positioned it so that you could access it with the expansion tank off. I think that's probably the best way to get to it, honestly. And remember, it doesn't need a lot of torque on it. So with that said, and the inlet pipe installed, the last thing that you're gonna have to worry about when you get your car running, and I'm probably gonna have to adjust this later when we have the airbox on, but you wanna make sure that the position is correct with the belt routing here so it doesn't come too far up and hit the alternator or go too far down and hit the pulley, because then it could start damaging the inlet here, obviously, and possibly damaging the pulley system. So when we do get the airbox on, you wanna make sure it kind of stays at this medium level where this ridge is on the alternator, and you want to make sure that there's plenty of clearance between the pulleys right there and the inlet pipe itself. So I've seen sometimes you can use a little bit of zip ties to hold this pipe to the fan once you got the fan installed, if you're worried about that clearance there. But I'm not sure that we'll have to do that. We'll probably end up finding out in a later episode. But for now, I think that's going to conclude our inlet installation. And overall, I'd say that wasn't too hard. Probably about 4 or 5 hours of work for me at least. But for you guys, you're definitely going to have to bleed the coolant system and remove the fan and air box and charge pipe to get access the way that I had access. But at the end of the day, I think that the best method is going to be lowering the front of the motor in order to get that pipe off, because cutting it can result in some of those plastic shavings going into the turbo, and that's really not what you want floating around in your intake system. So that's going to conclude our video for today, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching, and hopefully you learned something about installing the VRSF inlets on your N54 motor. It's not that hard of a job that you can tackle at home yourself, and there's ways to go about it without using a Sawzall. So stay tuned for more episodes on the 335i wagon as we get a couple more mods on it. Actually, the next one is going to be a pretty cool video I think you guys are going to love. But for now, be sure to leave a like or a comment down below with your thoughts. Subscribe to the channel if you're new and you haven't yet. And as always, I hope everyone has an awesome day. We'll see you next time.